Uh, I was I was heavily engaged in NAGPRA beginning in the late 1980s, even before there was a NAGPRA. Doing repatriation type work for the Pawnee Nation and the Native American Rights Fund out of Boulder, Colorado, and I remained active in repatriation for many years. I haven't been involved in it too much lately because the Pawnee Nation has its own repatriation program, and it's under the Cultural Resource Division of the Pawnee Nation. So, I helped develop that. I wrote the first NAGPRA grant to get that program, or to get a NAGPRA coordinator back in the 1990s. So I've been engaged in many different consultations, meetings, confrontations, uh, academic conferences, working on developing legislation, things like that, all related to NAGPRA. Well, this is a picture that I found of a young Apache woman from San Carlos Reservation, and uh, it was she was a part of the movement to protect Oak Flat in to the east of here in on the near the San Carlos Reservation. So they were attracting attention, and I think it was a cool scene of her walking down the street of New York City with a bow and arrow, wearing a skirt and her Apache moccasins. So yeah, sick and tired of being sick and tired. Well, we've experienced a lot of abuse over the years, and overcoming that has been quite a difficult procedure. But there are many of us committed to it, and NAGPRA is just one of these areas that we had to take on this fight to protect our ancestors and our own human rights. Okay, go ahead to the next. My title is a little different than is on the program. I think the program's title says about decolonizing NAGPRA. I forgot what it was, so I just put this down, but we'll be talking about some of those issues as we go through this lecture. Next slide, please. Okay, I don't use the term tribal nations. I use native nations because, empowerment is what we're about with our struggle to enhance Indian sovereignty. So I think when you use the terms tribal and nations, they're contradictory in many respects. Tribal kind of, it refers to tribe, but, the concept of tribalism, you hear that a lot today with the national politics in the United States. And when they talk about going tribal, they're talking about it in a negative context. So that's one reason I think that native nations is a better term. And so tribal in front of that kind of diminishes the concept. So I always try to use nation whenever I can, as opposed to a tribe. So yeah, so when we do our research, we have to look at our spiritual values, our spirituality, our beliefs, our sovereign powers, and then how and these are inherent things I'm talking about that come with our creation as native peoples. And then we have to look at westward U.S. expansion, federal laws and policies, and how they infringed upon our cultures, upon our sovereignty, upon our human rights. And treaties is a part of it, but I'm not going to talk too much about treaties. I may say a thing or two as we go through, but it's just important to remember that treaties are supposed to be the supreme law of the land, meaning that under the Constitution, treaties have more force than laws that passed by Congress. So NAGPRA is one of those laws that were passed by Congress. But treaties were fit into this because through treaties we entered into agreements with the United States government for many different things. We ceded our land, but we never ceded our right to control and own our own dead. So I guess that's why treaties are important to this presentation I'm giving. Go ahead to the next slide, please. Okay, so during the 1960s, late 1960s, the repatriation movement started. And it didn't start because of the goodness of the hearts of the U.S. government or archaeologists or anthropologists or others. it came from Indian people because Indian people, as the opening slide said, were sick and tired of being sick and tired. In this respect, sick and tired of the way the museums were handling the remains of Indian people, the cultural artifacts, um, how they were displayed, and how these practices infringe upon our indigenous and our human rights. So, one of the primary uh, goals was to stop grave looting in all forms. And I consider scientific study and pot hunting are the same, as being essentially the same thing, because it involved the desecration of our graves. Archaeologists look down on pot hunters because they see them as stealing what is the national resource, and that's Indian remains and other things from graves. Well, um, archaeologists do that as well, but they do it under the protection of the law oftentimes. So to protect mortuary practices and religious beliefs is a big part of the goal of the movement. Repatriate human remains, funerary objects, and cultural objects. Um, collectors, that when they went out to Indian country, they got as much as they could uh, from graves, and when much of this collection of cultural items was going on was in the late 1880s, early 1900s, and this is when Indian nations lived under the cloud of heavy federal oppression. Are any of you familiar with the codes of Indian offenses? If you're not, you should be. You can look them up online. But what these codes did was criminalize Indian dancing ceremonies, healing ceremonies, tried to break up traditional families, based upon polygamous relationships. And these practices were criminalized by the US government. So it was during this time period that Indian people were in dire economic straits, and some of them began to sell objects in their possession that they didn't have a right to sell because of hunger, because of this oppression. And there was also attempts to convert Indians to Christianity by teaching them that anything and everything that was Indian was bad. The boarding schools was going on, and the intent of boarding schools was to stamp the Indianness, to stomp the Indianness out of Indian people. Don and I's dad went to Indian school there in Pawnee, beginning when he didn't speak any English, and continued till he finished there and went to Chilocco, then ran away a few times, and he was allowed to stay at home after that. Uh, challenging academic discourses and practices with overt and covert and coded racial underpinnings. There's a lot of studies that are done about Indians, but how much is good and how much of it is value? A lot of these studies are written from that perspective of white racism and Indian inferiority. Even these studies about Indian culture, Indian burial practices, things like that. So, a part of our movement was to challenge this notion that archaeologists, physical anthropologists, and others had somehow this magical knowledge based upon the looting of graves about our ancestors. So, what we were doing, we were challenging offensive, immoral, and illegal practices of museums and universities, college professors, federal agencies, museums, to stop the trafficking in human remains and cultural objects, which is still a big problem. I'll talk about that in a little bit. So out of these goals was to one of the outcomes was the establishment of repatriation and cultural resource programs under the auspices of sovereign native nations. So this means that sovereignty is a big part of this. With federal laws, Indian people, Indian nations were deprived of their ownership of their remains. The federal government took control over that ownership through such acts as the Antiquity Act of 1906 and other acts just reinforced that. To achieve human rights of a lasting burial, this is a human right that all people take for granted, is that. And if a people want to donate their body to science, they have to go through a procedure to do so. But for Indians, this was never an option. Indians were considered inferior. If you can, if these invaders can claim Indian lands uh, because of the doctrine of discovery, then what's to stop them from claiming the remains of our ancestors in graves? Cultural survival, repatriation is related to cultural survival, to stop these abuses being committed against our inherent sovereign rights and our human rights, and to gain human rights and grave protection through legislation, and to attract allies to support our movement. So allies are important. When I was doing this repatriation work, it seems like we always had good allies working within these programs at universities and other places who would tell us what was going on. So these are the type of allies that we found very useful when we were trying to implement NAGPRA and make it work, and to convince these institutions that NAGPRA was Indian law, not science law. And I use the word Indian because I'm old school. Native American basically means anyone in this country could be Native American. Indian has a long history of use, and it's pretty clear about who we're speaking about, except some confusion with the people who come from India. But all these names are problematic: Indian, Native American, indigenous. If you wanted to be correct about the way it was to use a term, you'd have to start with the probably the Anishinaabe or the Abenaki in Maine, and go down to the Zunis in New Mexico and say them all, speed talking. But then if you did it correctly, then you'd have to shift it around, because the Zunis call themselves the Ashiwi, not the Zuni, but their official name is the Zuni. Anyways, I digress. So let's go on to the next PowerPoint. So there was an array of battlegrounds that we were engaged in when we were doing this repatriation advocacy. One of the first meetings that occurred about this issue was in the Black Hills at Bear Butte in the mid 1960s, when Suzanne Schoen Harjo, one of our Oklahoma sisters, and others met at Bear Butte to talk about the abuses that were going on in museums, about the way that human remains were being stored, displayed, desecrated. So there was a great deal of concern that came about this, and there was at other parts of the country, Indian people were becoming much more concerned about these practices because of the Indian movement. This is a picture from Alcatraz Island in the early months of the takeover in 1969, and I happened to be coming back from Vietnam at that time on an ammunition ship, and we went right by the island, and I could see the protests there and what was going on. For me, it was an eye opener about about the abuses that had been committed against Indians in the name of white supremacy, in the name of Christianity, in the name of progress, in the name of getting rid of Indian culture. So Indians began to protest, conduct marches and protests at universities, museums, conferences, and later on at the NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection Review Committee meetings and other places. So the battleground was the state legislative bodies, Congress, and the courts. So that meant that we had to educate ourselves about this history of Indian-white relations, about our own cultural values, our own beliefs, and use those as points for arguing for our human rights. Okay, next slide. So the grave looting started with the beginning of colonialism of this country. Some of the first settlers that came over on the Mayflower were starving within a short period of time. So they started looting Indian graves where they found corn. And the practice has just expanded from there. You had Thomas Jefferson and others who considered themselves to be refined gentlemen, uh, looting Indian graves on their property and establishing displays within their houses as a sign of their refinement, I guess. I could place that in a lot of different terms, we could call it ghoulish behavior or whatever. But somehow people thought this was a sign of their refinement. So they displayed skulls, burial objects, and other cultural objects in their houses. Then U.S. Soldiers, settlers, agents, archaeologists, physical anthropologists, museum curators became involved in the taking of human remains from graves. Then the university museums and federal agencies also did the same thing, and they became warehouses where increasing numbers of Indian remains were stored. Estimates say there's probably over 200,000 remains taken, but overall there was many more graves disrupted and bodies taken that were never accounted for. So grave looting grew from a cottage industry to the archaeology museum tradition, or industry, excuse me. So that's what we were fighting, an industry, this long history where white America thought it was okay to study human remains, to steal human remains for those studies, and to display them and to hold them in ways that violated our human rights. Let's go back to that picture of Franz Boas. And he was one of these grave stealers. He's considered the father of American anthropology because of his work developing the theory of cultural relativity and using that, saying that culture should be based upon our own values and beliefs as opposed to others. So he was innovative in several ways, but he was also a hypocritical graves body stealer. By days, he would collect Kwakiutl oral traditions, and by night, he would enter into the graveyard of these people and steal their human remains to fund his research. So this is what he wrote about what he's doing. It's the most pleasant to steal bones from a grave. What the use? Someone has to do it. No one had to do it. These people were doing it for their curiosity, for their professional development, for money, and for purposes that again violated our human rights. Go on to the next one, please. The next important step is the rise of scientific racism with Samuel B. Morton and his Crania Americana study that was published for the first time in 1839. So what Morton was trying to do was to try to prove that the white race was superior to all other races. Meaning that Caucasians had greater brain capacity that could be proven by taking measurements and weights of crania. Of course, Morton skewed his research data according to subsequent research to come out with outcomes that he expected. To prove the superiority of whites and the inferiorities of others. His influence was widespread and long-lasting. It affected scientific research, academic theories, public opinions, and the enactment of oppressive laws and policies that continue in some respects to this day. And he became honored for his crimes against humanity as a father of American physical anthropology. So this was something he wrote about Indians in that book. And these are all stereotypical representations. In their character, the Americans, meaning Indians, are averse to cultivation, meaning becoming like white Americans, and slow in acquiring knowledge. They are restless, revengeful, and fond of war, crafty, ungrateful, and unfeeling. They devour disgusting foods like pizza. I joke. Their mental facilities from infancy to old age present a continued childhood. And this is how a lot of these researchers who went into Indian country looked at Indians as being childlike adults. And these so-called childlike people could talk for hours and hours about ceremonies and about culture and teach these people, yet they were seen as being inferior intellectually. So that's the way racism works. Okay, next slide, please. Part of the industry required the selling of Indian remains, and this is one. What I have here is the cost of remains that were charged by Ward's Natural Science Establishment in their trade catalog, and they were based out of Rochester, New York. So Pawnee crania would go from $4 to $10. Cheyenne, the prices are all here. So how do you think they got these remains? They stole them. They were stolen, and the Wards became a leading provider of museums and universities worldwide. So this is how rampant it became. It was done in the open. It was seen as being legitimate. No moral or ethical constraints had to be followed when it came to Indians, because Indians were considered inferior. Next. So even a more shameful history, and these are just a couple examples dealing with Pawnees. And this Mulberry Creek Massacre, I've published several studies on this, and I also was asked to, when I was a graduate student at UCLA, to asked by NARF to do a study about the remains that were held at the Smithsonian Institute that identified some in that collection as being Pawnee, but the Smithsonian were saying that they weren't. So I conducted this study and found out indeed these individuals, there were 6 of them, were listed as being killed by U.S. soldiers and settlers in an unprovoked attack on a party of recently discharged Pawnee scouts in the winter of 1869. So these crania, they become subject to Morton-style studies at the Army Medical Museum. The Army Medical Museum was established in the 1860s as a place to study the impact of trauma from bullet wounds on soldiers during the Civil War. And then the museum began to collect Indian remains. And over the years, it collected nearly 4,000 or so from battlefields, concentration camps, like the Navajos who were sent to Bosque Redondo in the 1860s. And some of the people died there, and their remains were sent to the Army Medical Museum, and reservation graves. And I guess I was going to put something else with that extra comma there, so just ignore that. So this was done in that Surgeon General's directive to field surgeons to collect Indian remains was taken up with a great deal of enthusiasm and vigor by field surgeons and others who were willing to comply with that request. Another example is of White Fox, who was traveling in Europe with other Skeety Pawnees, and he died in January 1865. So what did the Swedish people do with his remains? They didn't give him a lasting burial. He was skinned, and the skin was placed on a plastic cast and put on public display at a museum there. So the Pawnees found out about this and were able to repatriate that remain in 1869. So this was the Pawnee Nation exerting its sovereignty in the international arena with the repatriation of White Fox. Next, please. And more abuses of Pawnee dead, and this is a picture of Asa Hill, who was a notorious looter of Pawnee graves. And here's what he wrote about his acts. his work. I don't play golf. Uh, my I'm getting blocked out on the side. There's something here I can't. Oops, what happened? Okay, you can read that, but I'm getting a list of people who was online blocking that out. Anyways, it's just that attitude they had, about playing golf, and he was active in this type of research into the 1930s, 1940s. Next, please. Um, Significance of this history, uh, a loss of our fundamental human rights, the rights to lasting burial, suppression of our sovereignty, a control over our control of the fate of our own deceased relatives, a loss of dignity by becoming designated the cultural property and resources of others, and Indian human remains served as classroom adornment, doorstops, comedy props, ashtrays, and occasional research. There was more emphasis placed on taking remains or stealing remains than there was of studying them. A lot of those remains in these boxes were never studied until we started asking for them back. Then they said, "Well, we can't give them back because they haven't been studied." Well, why haven't they been studied? The priority again was stealing, not studying. So important figures arose out of this movement. Suzanne Schoen Harjo, my my sister, who I've worked with for many years in matters of repatriation. She received a presidential commendation. I forget the exact name of it a few years ago from Obama. About all of her activism and service to Indian peoples. Vine Deloria, the famous um, Sioux scholar who became engaged in repatriation early on. William Tauble, a Northern Cheyenne, who was engaged in much of the earlier repatriation dialogue and working with the Smithsonian. Our Pawnee Nation president, Walter Echohawk, who was an attorney for NARF at the time. He and Suzanne were primary authors of NAGPRA and did a lot to make that law happen. Without them, who knows what could have come about, because Suzanne was well placed. She was the head of the National Congress of the American Indians. She knew how the Washington bureaucracy worked, and she had relationship with senators and others. I could have put on here, I should have put on here Senator Inouye from Hawaii, who was very instrumental. Without him and John McCain, this Democrat and Republican, these Democrat and Republican senators, it could have turned out different. So I had the privilege of working with most of these people, and I have fond memories and many stories to tell about that work, but not today. Next, please. And here's what Walter Echohawk said to sum this up. If you desecrate a white grave, you wind up sitting in prison, but desecrate an Indian grave and you get a PhD. The time has come for people to decide if we, that thing's in my way, are we Indians, a part of this country's living culture, or are we just here to supply museums with our dead? Addressing the racial assumptions and hypocrisy of what was going on in the museum archaeology industry. Next, please. So resistance, of course, whenever movements challenge the privileged status of others, there's resistance, and some of the terms were thrown at us were anti-science. We're not anti-science. We're pro-human rights. We're pro-Indian. Scientific research should not be controlled by the law. Indians will strip museums of their collections. Indians are religious fundamentalists and zealots. And future technological advances will reveal more about the past. So how can you bury something that is of such educational value? Well, if human remains were of such educational value, why weren't white cemeteries opened up for study? There's a lot we don't know about about non-Indians in this country. Would Congress ever pass a law that provided for the unearthing of those remains and placing them in institutions for study and taking their wedding rings and their Bibles and putting them on display somewhere? No, it never happened. And the condensation was that Indians need archaeologists to tell us our histories. We know our histories. Um, okay, let's go on to the next one. NAGPRA is human rights law. So this is how we're trying to decolonize NAGPRA, is to make it human rights law. And these are the categories of NAGPRA: human remains, funerary objects, objects of cultural patrimony, and sacred objects. Next one, please. A preponderance of evidence standard. That means that they're more than likely than not to be Indians. It's not like a criminal case where it's beyond a reasonable doubt. So it's like a standard set in civil cases to establish cultural affiliation with remains. So we found at these institutions that they were opposed to NAGPRA. So when we first started off, and they developed all kinds of strategies to undermine our work. One of the things that they did was they would classify a lot of the remains as being culturally unidentifiable, meaning that at that time they did not have to be repatriated. So they were trying to hang on as much as they could. They developed strategies to try to get Indians to fight amongst themselves over remains. They would use these scientific theories as a basis for denying repatriation requests. For example, with the Numic peoples of the Great Plains area, not the Great Plains, the Great Basin area, the museum personnel would say that archaeology says that these people did not move there until 4,000 years ago. So therefore, the claims could be dismissed. Well, they did that in violation with preponderance of evidence standard, and they would privilege museum theories or anthropology theories over Indian oral traditions, which said that some instances these people had been there since the beginning of time. So that's what I was talking about, establishing non-compliance. Next, please. Okay, the weaknesses. NAGPRA lacks a preamble explaining what its purposes are. Leaves determination of cultural affiliation with museums and federal agencies. Indians only have a right to consultation. Then don't you think it should be the other way around, where these museums have to prove that they have a right to control and access these, or rather than putting the burden of proof on Indians? It's always harder when you have to establish a burden of proof. But when this law was drafted, some compromises had to be made to get this law passed. Weak burial rights provisions. The burial rights were basically put under the American Archaeological Protection Act, which are weak, small penalties, and little funding going into enforcement. Does not apply to private collections. There's a lot of private collections out there in the world. It doesn't apply to private lands. Also, I don't think I put that on there, but meaning that burial sites on private lands could continue to be excavated without any constraints placed upon the landowners. Few civil penalties, which are provided in NAGPRA despite numerous violations of non-compliance, and inadequate funding. Next. Court cases. The most important one is the Swanson case against the United States, and this Ninth Circuit decision held that that the remains of the Ancient One, or Kennewick man, was not affiliated with the plaintiff Indian nations or any other present-day Indians, and they said that that NAGPRA was not the law to, that govern this return us from remain. It should be the Archaeological Resource Protection Act. And then a footnote said, in so holding, we necessarily determine that no reasonable person can conclude by a preponderance of evidence on this record that Kennewick man is Native American. Next one, please. The problems with this decision was the judge at the trial court level and the district court level and the appellate court level held that privileged scientific speculation over Indian privileged scientific speculation over Indian oral history, religious freedom, and human rights, denigrated oral histories, our ways of knowing the past, by characterizing them as little more than fairy tales, and it ignored the flaws, biases, and limitations of scientific inquiry, which are very many, and these theories change all the time. They're always being, new research tries to disprove other theories. So, that decision didn't even mention any of that. And it should be noted that DNA testing subsequently showed that Indian oral tradition is more accurate than scientific theory in this case, because that study found that the four plaintiff Indian nations from the Pacific Northwest were indeed related to the Ancient One. And because of that DNA analysis, the federal government repatriated the Ancient One to those Indian nations, and his remains were reburied. But that doesn't mean we should support DNA testing. DNA is invasive, and it involves the destruction of bone material. So many of us are opposed to DNA. And that this, ironically, is one case where it did prove to be very useful. Next. Unfinished business. Pot hunters continue to operate. Here's some characteristics of the pot hunters. Are generational. It runs in their families. They take college courses to learn about what they're doing, about where to find graves, perhaps about what are in graves. They often operate under the cover of darkness and in isolated areas in both public and private lands. They're often armed and on amphetamines, so they're dangerous. And they're often protected by local police, prosecutors, and judges from small towns because they were raised in these areas where this was an accepted practice. Law enforcement agencies lack adequate resources to enforce laws. And quite frankly, the court system often didn't see these issues as being important, so no charges were often filed against those individuals who were charged with or who are doing this looting in violation of the law. And there's been slow and resistance to a compliance with NAGPRA by federal museums and agencies. Next. But our results have been significant. The reburial of thousands of human remains. Indian nations are exerting their inherent sovereignty in repatriation matters by establishing repatriation and cultural resource divisions that deal with federal agencies, state agencies, private landowners, and others in matters pertaining to Indian burials and repatriation. We've gained a say in the operations of museums. Before, the doors were shut to us, but we are making museums and America a better place because of our work, because of our breaking down of racial barriers, of our attempts to force America to live up to its democratic ideals, and make us consider us to be equals in as humans.